Imagine standing in the courtroom, your heart pounding as you face an unexpected enemy, the law itself. You're Melania Trump, a former First Lady, a woman who's been the subject of intense public scrutiny, the whispers of the powerful, and the expectations of millions. But today it's not the public you're facing. It's the judge, whose decision could change everything. The room goes silent as the judge announces his ruling, a fine, a penalty that seems to be handed down with little consideration. It's an insult, a slap in the face. The people in the gallery murmur, some in shock, some in approval. But Melania, she stands still, her eyes narrowing. This isn't just about money. This is about respect, reputation, and justice. The camera zooms in on her face, capturing the subtle flicker of determination. She's been quiet, always under the radar, never one to make waves, but in this moment the stakes are too high. For the first time in her life, Melania is about to show the world a side of her no one has ever seen. What happens next? What if Melania Trump, of all people, could turn this situation on its head and leave the judge and everyone in that courtroom completely stunned by the brilliance of her legal acumen? Could she fight back? Not with the same old tactics, but with a strategy that no one saw coming? Stay with me, because this story is about to take a turn no one expected, one that will shake the courtroom and the nation to its core. Melania Trump had never been one to rock the boat. For years, she'd played the role of a dutiful wife, staying in the shadows while her husband, Donald Trump, made headlines and built an empire of fame, wealth, and power. Yet despite her quiet demeanor, her life was far from ordinary. The world watched her every move, every glance, every outfit, every word. But the scrutiny she faced was different from what most women endured. It was a constant reminder that no matter how much she accomplished or how much she sacrificed, she would always be judged through the lens of her husband's name and actions. She was forever tied to his image, and that image was as polarizing as it was powerful. But today in this courtroom things were different. For once, Melania wasn't just the former First Lady, the wife of the controversial Donald Trump. She wasn't just a woman whose life had been a series of public moments, plastered across tabloids, social media, and news outlets. Today she was a woman facing a legal battle, a battle that would decide her future, her reputation, and perhaps her legacy. The judge, a man whose credentials were well respected in legal circles, had just delivered a verdict that caught everyone off guard, a fine, a legal penalty for a case involving a minor offense, or so it seemed. For a woman of Melania's stature, this was more than just a fine. It was an accusation, an insult, a slap in the face from a system that didn't care about her side of the story. And what stung even more was that the fine had come from a judge who had never hesitated to align himself with the powerful elite. The judge was no stranger to influence. He had worked with politicians, businessmen, and celebrities, people whose names carried weight in every room they entered. He had a reputation for being fair, but fair didn't always mean just. Fair didn't always mean equal. Melania had seen enough of the legal world to know that sometimes fairness was simply a mask for something much darker: bias, favoritism, and power. The court had been filled with eager eyes, reporters, lawyers, spectators, all hoping for a dramatic moment. They got what they wanted. But what they didn't know was that this wasn't just about a fine. This wasn't just about Melania's past or the court of public opinion. This was about power, and who had it. It didn't take long for the injustice to become clear. This fine wasn't about Melania's actions. It wasn't even about her. It was about something much bigger, the way the legal system, often influenced by money and status, had been used to silence her, to make her small in a world that had already been so quick to label her. It was about the deep-seated discrimination that came with being a woman of her stature, expected to remain silent, expected to follow the rules, and above all, expected to be grateful for the scraps of fairness that others decided to throw her way. Melania's life had always been marked by these silent battles. From her early years in Slovenia to her rise in America, she had learned that to survive in a world dominated by men, by the wealthy, by the powerful. You had to play by their rules, and she had. Until now. She had smiled when they told her she was too quiet, too foreign, too much of an enigma. She had endured the whispers behind her back, the sly comments about her accent, her background, her marriage to a man who polarized the nation. But none of it had prepared her for this moment. The fine wasn't just a financial penalty. It was a statement. A statement that no matter who you were or what you had accomplished, you were still at the mercy of those who controlled the rules. The people who sat in positions of power, who held the gavel, who made decisions that affected the lives of ordinary people, often didn't have to answer for their own actions. In fact, they didn't even have to explain their decisions. Their word was law. And yet, here she stood. In a room full of people who had already written her off, already judged her, already assumed she would cower in defeat. But Melania was different. The public didn't know it, but she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She had learned the ways of the powerful, how to observe, how to wait for the right time. The court may have underestimated her, but they hadn't taken into account her resilience, her quiet brilliance. They didn't know that she had been studying the law, observing how power operated, how those who were wronged could fight back, and fight back she would. This was more than just a fine. This was about sending a message, about taking control when everyone expected her to bow down. The injustice wasn't just in the ruling, it was in the system itself, in the way that power structures worked to keep certain people in their place. Today, Melania Trump wasn't just going to sit back and accept the punishment that society had decided for her. No, today she was about to flip the script on everyone who thought she was just a figurehead, just a woman who had to smile and nod. They had no idea what was coming. And the courtroom, the world, they were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. The fine had been handed down, and with it the courtroom was buzzing with disbelief. The murmurs spread like wildfire. How could Melania Trump of all people be penalized in such a public way? The cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing the moment, but none of them could capture the crushing weight that rested on her shoulders. She had expected a fair hearing, a rational decision, but instead she had been served a penalty that made her seem like just another privileged person, being held accountable for something that was, in the grand scheme of things, trivial. As the judge spoke his final words, dismissing the case with a cold finality, Melania's heart sank. She had hoped for a different outcome, a moment of clarity, of fairness, but instead, she felt something much deeper. The injustice wasn't just in the ruling, it was in the way it made her feel, small, insignificant, caught in a system that only seemed to favor those with enough money, enough influence, enough power. For a brief moment, she considered just walking out of the courtroom. What more was there to say? The system had already spoken. The media would move on to the next scandal, the next headline. She'd be forgotten just like the countless others who had been trampled by the same system before her. But then, something inside her stirred, a voice quiet at first but growing louder with every passing second. This wasn't who she was. She wasn't just a symbol. She wasn't just a name to be tossed around by the tabloids or a trophy to be claimed by the powerful. She had been underestimated her entire life, her actions misjudged and dismissed. And now, in this moment, they had miscalculated again. For years, she had been pushed to the sidelines, forced to play the role of the dutiful wife, the supportive figure, the one who kept her head down while her husband took the spotlight. But this fine was different. This wasn't just about her husband's empire. It wasn't about being the former First Lady, or even being married to one of the most controversial figures in America. This was about her dignity, her identity, her sense of justice. The weight of the injustice she was facing felt like a tidal wave, but with it came something unexpected, a sense of clarity, of power. The judge had assumed she would quietly accept this penalty, like so many others in her position had done. The system expected her to shrink back, to take the hit and disappear into the background. But that wasn't going to happen. Her mind raced, analyzing the situation. The ruling was unfair, but it wasn't the end. There were avenues, legal loopholes, precedents that could be cited. This wasn't the first time a powerful figure had been held accountable for something small, only to have the system bend for them when it was time for the real consequences to surface. Melania had seen it all before. She knew the game. And now she was ready to play it. The decision she faced was clear: to walk away quietly and let the injustice sit, or to fight back, to expose the flaws in the system, to remind everyone, judge, media, and the public alike, that there were consequences for those who abused their power. For a brief moment she doubted herself. Was she strong enough for this fight? Was it worth it? The media, the public, the scrutiny, would she be able to withstand it all? But then, the realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. She didn't need to fight for fame, for validation, or for the approval of others. She was fighting for something much more important. She was fighting for what was right. And in that moment, Melania made a choice that would change everything. The fine wasn't just about money. It wasn't even about the courtroom. It was about reclaiming her voice, her agency. She had been boxed into a role for far too long, forced to play by others' rules. But now, in this moment, she realized that she had a choice. She didn't have to be the woman everyone expected her to be. She didn't have to remain the silent, passive figure in the background. She could challenge the system, she could challenge the judge, and she could do it in a way that no one had anticipated. The room grew heavier with the tension, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. The fine, the ruling, the way she had been treated, it all led to this. Her breaking point. Her heart raced, but the doubt was gone. There was no turning back now. Melania stood up slowly, her eyes locking onto the judge. For the first time, she felt a rush of power. She wasn't the woman who would be dismissed. She wasn't the woman who would be silenced. And now, it was time for everyone in that room to realize that she had just begun to play her hand. It wasn't over. It had just begun. And the world was about to see Melania Trump in a way they had never seen her before. As the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, Melania's decision was made. She had been silenced, judged, and underestimated for so long. Today she would change that narrative. The judge, who had presumed her compliance, shifted uneasily in his seat as she made her move. The whole room, still buzzing with disbelief at her sudden resolve, fell silent in an instant. Melania's calm demeanor had concealed her greatest strength, her sharp mind. She had never been one to make rash decisions, and this moment was no exception. In the weeks leading up to the trial, she had quietly observed every angle of the case, every piece of evidence, every legal precedent. She wasn't a lawyer, but she had learned to navigate this world, studying the intricacies of law and policy from the shadows. What the judge hadn't known was that Melania had spent more than enough time understanding the very system that sought to humble her. Her next words struck like a thunderclap, shattering the tense silence that had settled over the courtroom. "I'm not paying this fine." The statement hung in the air, but it wasn't just her words that caused a stir. It was the confidence with which she spoke. It was the knowing glint in her eyes, as though she had already calculated the next steps, already seen the way forward. The judge looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion, as if he couldn't fathom why she would defy his ruling. This wasn't just an issue of the fine. It was an issue of authority, of who had the power in the room. Melania leaned forward, her voice steady but firm as she revealed something no one could have anticipated. "There's a clause in this case that was never addressed, one that was intentionally overlooked." The judge's eyes narrowed as Melania dropped her bombshell. The clause she was referring to was buried deep within the legal framework that had been used against her. It was a technicality, a small detail most people would have missed. But Melania, she had found it. "It's a violation of due process," she continued. "You failed to acknowledge a conflict of interest when assigning this case to your court." The room erupted in whispers, some in disbelief, others in awe. The judge's face turned an unexpected shade of red as he processed what Melania had just revealed. He was caught off guard. His grip on the situation, the tight control he'd had over the proceedings, was beginning to slip. He hadn't expected anyone to challenge him, especially not Melania Trump. It was clear now that the fine wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger issue, one that revealed cracks in the system that Melania had quietly studied and understood. She had done her homework, and it was her turn to show that knowledge to the world. The judge's hands shook slightly as he adjusted his glasses, his composure cracking for the first time. It was a rare sight, an authoritative figure so sure of their control, now unbalanced by a revelation they hadn't anticipated. But Melania didn't stop there. She wasn't done. "You're not just making a mistake with this case," she pressed, her voice growing stronger. "This is a pattern, a dangerous one. The public's trust in this system is fragile. And you, sir, are contributing to that erosion. The fine you imposed on me wasn't just an injustice to me. It's an injustice to the very people who rely on courts like this to uphold fairness." The judge recoiled as Melania's words cut deeper, but she wasn't finished. She had more to expose. What Melania understood, what the judge and the others in the room failed to realize, was that this wasn't just a legal matter. It was personal. It was about the hypocrisy of a system that had long been built to protect the powerful, while keeping everyone else in their place. The rich, the famous, the connected. These people were given the benefit of the doubt. But Melania wasn't one of them. She wasn't just going to roll over and accept their terms. The tension in the room skyrocketed, everyone now watching as Melania dismantled the judge's authority piece by piece. What had started as a simple legal case about a fine had quickly escalated into something far bigger, an indictment of the very system that allowed the powerful to impose their will without question. Melania's hidden strength was finally revealed. It wasn't just her status or wealth that had allowed her to reach this point. It was her resilience, her sharp mind, and her quiet determination to expose the flaws in a system that thought it could suppress her. She wasn't just a figurehead. She wasn't just the wife of a former president. She was a force to be reckoned with. The judge, now visibly rattled, began to stammer, trying to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. The momentum had shifted, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. Melania had turned the tide, and the judge's carefully constructed position of power was crumbling. The room was no longer under his control. The power had shifted to her, and with it, the audience's perception of her as just another privileged figure was beginning to fade. The walls that had once confined her, both in the courtroom and in the public eye, were crumbling. Melania Trump, the quiet former First Lady, was showing the world that she was anything but powerless. This was no longer just a legal battle. It was a battle for truth, for justice, and for the power that had been denied to her for so long. And as the judge stammered for words, trying to salvage his dignity, Melania stood tall, knowing that she had already won. The reversal was complete. She had turned the tables. She had shown that the real power lay not in the court's rulings, but in the ability to expose the truth. And she had just done that, in front of an audience that would never forget. The courtroom was electric with tension. Every word Melania had spoken resonated through the air, like an unseen force that had completely shifted the atmosphere. The judge, once poised with authority, was now visibly rattled, his face flushed with a mix of confusion and anger, but it was too late for him to regain control. The damage had been done. Melania had exposed the cracks in the system that so many had long ignored. Her revelation about the clause, the conflict of interest, and the unfairness in the proceedings was not just a legal technicality. It was a message. A message that spoke to the very core of what justice meant. It wasn't about power or influence. It was about fairness. It was about holding everyone to the same standard, no matter their name or their station in life. The judge tried to gather his composure, but his stammering was in vain. His words faltered as the courtroom waited in silence, everyone aware that the tables had been completely turned. Melania had done something no one thought she could. She had revealed the judge's vulnerability, his bias, and his misuse of authority, and now it was his turn to face the consequences, and they came swiftly. The press, who had been buzzing about the case for weeks, had no choice but to cover Melania's stunning defense. Headlines shifted overnight. No longer was she the quiet, unassuming figure standing beside her husband. Now she was the one who had stood up against the establishment. The powerful elite who had presumed to dictate her fate were now under the scrutiny of the same system they had so often manipulated. Within days, the judge found himself at the center of a growing scandal. Investigations were launched into his handling of the case. His past decisions were being examined, and it didn't take long before people began to question the integrity of his rulings. The once respected figure who had wielded power with a sense of invulnerability was now facing a reckoning. The system that had once protected him began to turn against him, and the more the public learned about his biased decisions, the more the calls for his resignation grew louder. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. The judge, who had believed that Melania would be a passive player in this game, had underestimated her. He had believed he could brush her aside, issue a fine, and move on. But in reality, Melania's quiet strength had exposed a much larger issue, an issue of corruption, of influence, and of a system that allowed the powerful to remain untouchable. In the end, it wasn't Melania who was going to pay the price. It was the judge, whose career now lay in ruins. The sense of justice was palpable. For Melania, this wasn't about getting revenge. It wasn't about winning for the sake of winning. It was about exposing the truth, about showing that even in a world built on power and influence, fairness still had a place. And when the truth came to light, there was no escaping it. But the justice didn't end with the judge's downfall. Melania had shown the world that she wasn't just a figure to be controlled or dismissed. She wasn't just a name attached to her husband's legacy. She was a woman who could stand on her own, who could fight back against an unjust system, and who could win. It was a message to every person who had ever felt powerless, every person who had been silenced or dismissed, that they too had a voice. As the judge's resignation became official and his reputation crumbled, Melania found herself in a moment of quiet reflection. It wasn't the triumph she had expected, but the relief she felt was undeniable. She had done something few could have imagined. She had exposed the hypocrisy of a system that treated the powerful differently, and in doing so, she had secured her own sense of dignity and justice. And what's more, she had reminded the world of something important, that true power doesn't lie in money, in status, or in influence. True power lies in the ability to stand up for what's right, to challenge injustice when it's staring you in the face, and to have the courage to speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. As the media buzzed with coverage of the judge's fall from grace, Melania remained a quiet force. The world may have been watching her, but she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She had already proven the most important thing, that justice, though slow and often overlooked, always finds its way to the surface. In the end, it wasn't about a fine or a legal case. It was about power. Who had it? Who was allowed to wield it, and who had the courage to challenge it? And as Melania walked away from that courtroom, the message was clear. No one, no matter their position, was above the law. And in the end, she walked away with something much more valuable than any courtroom victory could offer. She had earned respect, not as the wife of a former president, but as a woman who had dared to stand up for what was right, a woman who had fought for justice and had seen it prevail. She didn't need revenge, because justice had already been served. The powerful had lost everything they thought they controlled, while Melania Trump walked away with something far greater: her dignity, her respect, and the lesson that those who try to silence others can never escape the truth.